I learned early, on my first full day that lasted 3 mornings and a postponed afternoon, that elevators in the borough of impossible coincidences are not appliances but rituals. They are consecrated machinery, trimmed with brass and superstition, and they obey rules no building code would recognize. They also have an operator, which is to say they have someone who knows the secret of which buttons to avoid, and which to press twice when a weekday has the temerity to file itself under miscellaneous emotions. Sally was leaning against the console like a woman who had been practicing patience a long time, and who had the bones of a saint about her wrists. She wore a cap with a frayed brim and an apron pocket that looked as if it had been sewn from an old calendar. There were buttons in the pocket, small circles of metal, each labeled not with numbers but with words overdue, misfiled, 4th quarter regret, and a single, battered button stamped simply, "Do not resuscitate Monday." Sally tugged the cap down and regarded me with a look that combined amusement and precise caution. "We don't let shiny-eyed interns press the buttons," she said, and her voice was the comfortable sort that could make a stapler feel heard. "We let them press other things, like hopes or apologies. Buttons are for people who've read the labels." She tapped the brass rail with a nail that had ledger residue under it, and the elevator answered like a well-trained cat, its lights knitting and the floor indicators stuttering in a way that suggested it was clearing its throat. We rode in relative silence, which in the borough is a conversation. The car hummed with the sound of pulleys that had probably been bribed once or twice over tea and signatures. I studied the panel. The buttons were arranged, not numerically, but by administrative temperament. Folding sat above deferred pleasantries. Annex Als nestled next to lost weekends. And near the bottom, where one would usually find a mechanical basement, there was a sighing brass oval labeled Basement of Amendments. "Every floor smells different," Sally informed me, as if imparting a cardinal rule. "If you can tell the odor, you can tell the problem, sent before syllable, almost always." She smiled as if she had recited it in a litany 1,000 times. I must have made the face people make when they are cataloging oddities. It does. Sure. 6th smells like misplaced birthdays, too sweet, like overbaked cake. 3rd smells like rain you forgot to schedule. 2nd smells like she inhaled theatrically and then, as if embarrassed to be sentimental in an elevator, said, like procrastination and toner. On the board beyond the car's glass, the bureau had posted that day's map of misplacements. It looked at first like a child's star chart, gilded pins and blue string, a constellation of absences that tied together petty tragedies and civic inconveniences. But there were notes in a precise, indignant hand: Wed 1015 Mayor's Hat Anomaly, 2009-47 Public Library's History of Umbrellas misfiled under Poems. Mon various minor regrets misallocated to advisory notes. Sally guided the car between those odor-marked levels, and when the doors sighed open we were released into atmospheres that made my throat constrict with odd recognition. On the 2nd floor, a receptionist handed me a clipboard, and it hummed like a cat. Its pen had the wrong name for ink. On the 6th there was a pile of boxed candles, each labeled for a celebration that had never been lit. Somebody had misfiled an anniversary, and the candles were tired of waiting. Our mission that morning was to map where moments had gone missing. That is a sentence that looks smaller on paper than it does in the body. To map absence is to invent a language for ghost things, a cross-hatched diagram for weekdays that have been temporarily misplaced, a ledger for jokes that were told before their time. I had grown up with a parent who catalogued family memories, who believed that if you wrote something down you could resist its evaporation. The bureau's version of that faith felt much larger and much sneakier. It preferred to choral absences in ways that made them useful rather than simply preserving them like museum pieces. At a long workable someone me's ledger, I later learned had pinned a swath of string between clipped notes, connecting spaces like a spider of red tape. The nodes had names. Filing room C hummed like a throat clearing. Sub-basement B smelled like wet wool. The break room registered as a small, domestic universe of its own. The file sprite hovered between pages like a comma on the edge of a thought. A margin literally brushed the paper with a tiny tooth and a soft, sucking sound and left coffee ring wisdom in return. Ellipses of insight that smelled faintly of cinnamon. When we mapped, we placed pins where a day had been seen last. We anchored absences with petty objects, an orphaned mitten that had been found complaining in a coat pocket. A sandwich that insisted it remembered being someone else. A receipt for a festival that had never happened. Each object was evidence, and each piece taught me how the Bureau thought, not in absolutes, but in stitched-together narratives. We learned that Tuesday had wandered, in a dizzying little pilgrimage, into last Thursday's paperwork. That is the sort of sentence you can say and make people laugh. Until you watch someone's small child stop believing in birthdays because the day itself had been given the wrong vendor. Office politics insinuated itself into our mapping like a faint mildew. There is, in every bureaucracy, a hidden grammar of efficiency vs empathy. At the Bureau it wore two faces, one of gears and one of parchment. The automation faction wanted to cordon off misplacements with algorithms and marching stamps. They wanted to install devices that would simply, politely return all days to their appointed places and never allow for a lobster hat to become a civic mascot. The humanist faction, me's ledger among them, argued for a slower, hands-on stewardship, signatures, consultations, a taste test of Mabel's soups before a decision was made. Once you let a machine decide what is delightful, me's ledger had told a meeting yesterday, pinching the bridge of her nose with a pen that bled an obnoxious amount of ink. You lose the small kindness that lives in the margins. Everyone nodded because me's ledger's nods were as compelling as law. Owen, who liked to dress like a metaphor gone to seed, flitted between positions. He delighted in the absurdity of human judgment and feared the iron logic of automation in equal measure. He stapled ideas together with a flourish and was likely, in quieter moments, to bury a stubborn old file behind a radiator and pretend it didn't exist. That morning, his eyes had a flint in them, the kind that suggests someone weighing whether to light something they cannot later unmake. Mabel's domain, the break room, felt for a while like the true center of the Bureau. It was small and warm, with a kettle that had the habit of pausing mid-bubble and then finishing a sentence. Her soup was famous and disconcerting. It predicted small coincidences by taste. Her broth that morning tasted of rain on bakery windows and the sort of forgiveness that is easier accepted in a bowl. She ladled me a cup and said, "Your mouth will tell you if you'll need to make a decision, or if the universe already made it for you and you're only catching up." She did not explain what that meant. No one at the Bureau explained their metaphors fully. They preferred to let them mature. As we mapped, retired versions of officials drifted in the hallways. These were their younger selves, or older ones, or something that looked like them but remembered different regulations. The phenomenon is disconcerting in a way that tastes like stale coffee. You bump into a man who used to be your supervisor, and he looks at you as if you are an interesting dossier. "Ah," he says, folding his hands, a clerical apprentice. "Do you know how to file a sadness?" He is 3 promotions younger and full of optimism that has not yet been taxed by experience. He wanders off humming a memorandum I have never heard before. There was a kind of theater to that morning's movement, a choreography that required less rehearsal than one would think, because the actors had been improvising for years. Sally cued the elevator like a conductor counts a downbeat. "Third," she said, and the doors sighed. "Third for rain you forgot to schedule." A woman carrying a folder that smelled like lemon walked out and looked at me as if she had just remembered an appointment she had always intended to miss. We compiled the map with tangible implements, pins, threads, and an enormous label maker that hummed melodramatically when Registrar Amy fed it a strip of paper. Amy was calm and efficient in a way that made her seem omniscient. She stamped our petitions with a small, accepting smile, as if she knew that bureaucracy could be humane if one treated stamps like tiny absolutions. "We will process this," she whispered when I handed her an emergency requisition in which had tried to sound more confident than I felt. Her stamp made a sound like a heart settling in a chest. The patterns emerged like tide lines. Tuesdays tended to drift toward Thursdays when staff were hungry. Ones laced with minor regrets liked basements where apologies were catalogued. The most charming errors, the kind that made street performers smile and marriage proposals slightly more honest, often clung to the break room. The map, once erased of its indecisive scrawl, suggested a systemic weakness rather than the occasional, solitary slip. Misplacements were not individual acts of carelessness so much as a rhythm of a building deciding to redistribute small wonders. The debate about automation ramped up in the boardroom. A representative from the automation committee arrived with a briefcase full of charts that smelled faintly of ozone and certainty. She spoke with the clean cadence of a metronome. "Machines can enforce continuity with a 99.9% success rate," she said. "They will reduce the chance of civic embarrassment and increase public confidence." Someone in the room coughed, and it sounded like a paper being folded with displeasure. Ms. Ledger answered with a story. Once, years ago, she had rewritten a regulation for the sake of a weather festival. The story had saved a town from a week of torrential, bureaucratic rain and had also allowed a child to keep a day he had promised his grandmother. "Not every misplacement is a mistake," she said, and I could see in her hands, the ledger stitch in her coat, that her words were not merely rhetoric but a small, worn theology. Between the crescendos of argument we continued to map. "Mip!" Pockets appeared with a hand muffled in improbable linen and produced an item that I did not recognize at first, a small, citizen-submitted charm that smelled of burnt toast and promises. He had a parade of orphaned umbrellas clanking in his pockets and smiled as if each one had a backstory. "Found this behind the radiator of 4th. If you have never had the pleasure of being introduced to a creature by a paperclip, then the bureau will not seem like the proper place to begin. But most of the meaningful things I've learned in government work have involved objects with more personality than their official descriptions allow. Paperclips, for instance, have an astonishing capacity for politeness when asked to hold things together and a stubbornness when asked to release them. They will, as Ms. Ledger once told me under her breath, fold to their job and then fold again until they are ornaments of memory. So it should not have been a surprise that when the trouble in our office finally earned a name. The naming occurred during a routine sort of inspection and involved ink stains, a wary finger, and a woman who keeps a ledger literally stitched into her coat. That is Helms. Ledger tended to reconcile her affection for order with the chaos we made in a normal week. She called things by their bureaucratic terms and thereby made them accountable to the folder where they belonged. On the morning we particularly needed a name, the building smelled like tunner and rain. There is always rain in that particular smell here, even when the gutters outside are politely dry. Tunner plus the promise of weather is the bureau's perfume. It announces that whatever you do with paper, the folding, the stamping, the very act of deciding whether something should be bound or shredded has consequences beyond the edge of your desk. I found the first evidence on the carpet at the foot of Mims' Ledger's office door. It looked, at first, like a spill, a smear of grey smudged ink that had soaked into the weave and refused to be fully mopped away. It would have been easy to ignore there are always smears in large offices, but this smear had a sense of purpose. The way it drew along the grout lines of the tiles suggested it had been following a map of margins, and the way a comma sat dead at its leading toe like a tiny coin suggested a mischievous intelligence rather than an accident. I was the one who noticed it because I had been brought there on a pretense. Ledger had tasked me with delivering her tea, and a small correction to a motion about paperclip allowances. The tea was always a test, I later learned. A cup that revealed whether you could hold steady when the world insisted on being wrong. My hands were shaking, partly because the blazer I wore was 2 sizes too large and partly because I had, the day before, misfiled a Form 42B in a sequence I could not at first trace. Small errors have a way of puffing up overnight. Me's. Ledger was crouched by the smear, the crease of worry in her suit deepening. She wore that look she keeps for staff meetings and for explaining why the public doesn't need to know about the time a calendar refused to flip. I set the tea on her knee, and she accepted it with a nod that was both thank you and an instruction, pay attention. "What do you make of this, August?" she said, tapping the ink with the edge of a postage stamp. The stamp left a ring like a tiny sun on the smear, and the smear answered with a dull shadow, as if the ink admired the stamp's neatness and refused to be impressed. I considered saying a spill or an old redaction, things that sound like containment. But I had learned enough to know when language was a hammock and when it was a cage. So I answered with the only honesty my training could offer, "It looks concentrated, ma'am." Like it had a purpose. She straightened. "Names make things accountable," she said. "If we put a name on it, we can decide where to file it. Naming is a bureaucratic technique, an emotional one. It renders the unknown administratively tractable. You can only sign a form for something that has a name. You cannot issue an exemption for weirdness without a noun, Ms. Ledger had used that method my whole tenure there when she needed to save a weather festival or to reclassify an orphaned holiday. She reached into her coat and pulled out a descriptor, and then folded the world toward that descriptor until it complied. She put her finger into the ink. Not the elegant, archival touch that I had seen Chief Harmon use, the kind that is more like a blessing than a test. She pressed with a pragmatic, used gesture, a bureaucrat checking the temperature of a problem. The smear resisted like an opinion. "Oh," she said very softly. It was the kind of "oh" that the bureau uses to finish sentences without saying them aloud. "What is it?" I asked, though by then I knew she would give the creature a title, and that the title would make the room a little colder. "It's a slip." She said it as if reading from a ledger long kept in inked margins. Slip. The word had a humidity to it, like something that moves under doors when the wind gets bored. A slip, she continued, is a byproduct of the kinds of things we shred. I felt a small, shameful re-education. Shreds are where the Bureau keeps its regrets, literal paper confessions, redactions, amendments that were supposed to be final until someone decided they were not. Shredding is a ritual of forgetting that sometimes goes wrong. Machines have moods. Redaction rollers can be mischievous when unsupervised. Mez. Ledger told me of a machine once left to chew its fill during a budget meeting. When they returned, an entire day of minutes had been turned to ribbons, and something had stepped out of the ribbons with a taste for rearranged phrases. "This one," she said, tapping the smear, "is old. It likes commas. It prefers to tinker. It is not a destroyer, August. It is an editor with opinions. An editor with opinions." I could have laughed except that the ink under her finger shifted, as if listening to the word and considering whether it could accept the definition. It left a small apostrophe like a footprint. "What do we call it?" I asked, because names are the work we do and because I wanted the ritual of procedure to soothe my frantic hands. "Call it the slip," Ledger said. "Call it by its proper name. Then we can log it. That's how the Bureau begins to tell stories, by naming. The name does not make the thing small. It simply puts the thing into the file where someone might someday answer for it. We did not, at first, imagine the slip as a theatrical villain. Our jobs make us long-term skeptics of spectacular chaos. We handle anomalies with a kind of long patience, a petition here, a stamp there, a controlled rectification. But that morning, between the sound of the tea cooling and the tremor in the fluorescent lights, something else arrived. Evidence that the slip had been out walking, and had left not only ink but behavior in its wake. "You should probably tell Harmon," Ms. Ledger said. "Harmon Vance's office is one of those places that announces authority not by volume, but by the persistent hum of things that remember." His key, a small iron object that thrummed faintly when he spoke, was an instrument for opening vaults and for measuring how urgently one should behave. The corridor to his door is lined with framed directives that sometimes rearrange themselves when no one is watching. On the day we went to visit, the frames were turning their pages slowly, like the building had taken to itself the idea of pacing. The sound was like a library breathing. Harmon accepted us like a man who had long ago made peace with being the person people came to when their metaphors failed. He did not gasp or shriek. He received our report with a patience that smelled faintly of old ink and chamomile. "A slip," he repeated, rolling the name in his mouth the way a scholar would taste a rare word. "We have had whispers. A few anomalies, small, unharmful times out of joint, misaddressed memos, they grow from neglect. We must be careful not to rewrite more than we save." "What do you recommend?" Ms. Ledger asked. She did not so much ask for advice as invite a policy paper. Harmon tapped his key against the desk. It made a sound like a clock deciding whether to join in. "We catalog, we trace. We avoid heavy-handed erasure. Quite often these things are a system's way of asserting that some discarded item should remain. They are, in a manner of speaking, the Bureau's conscience." "Conscience," Owen said behind me. He had appeared like an afterthought with a thermos and a sardonic grin. "It probably tastes like stale coffee." Owen's grin always cut through the room's humidity. He has the knack for turning our gravest procedures into parables about poorly made sandwiches. He sat down on the radiator and told his story without preface. "Once," he said, "we had a ledger that swallowed an intern's day." It is the sort of story that sounds like mythology when told by someone who has been a field fixer longer than he should have. I braced for the punchline because Owen likes punchlines like a magician likes misdirection. "This was before my time at the Barrow," he said. "Well, before it was called a bureau in that building. There was a ledger that had been overstuffed. It had a fondness for the small, inconvenient entries, the kind of note you stick in the margin, because it makes you feel like a person. An intern, bless them, went to file something and the ledger, being old and oddly jealous, drew the day's page into itself. For a week that intern remembered a meeting that had never happened. People went on with their days. The intern wrote minutes that reflected an invented but very gentle schedule. "Owen," Ms. Ledger said, "are you being allegorical again?" "Only partially," he replied. The intern came back, blanker in the places where worry had lived and full in the places where wonder used to be. We could have erased the ledger's appetite and returned the day to its neat sequence. But one of the things we are about here is to tend to what people care for, even when their care is inconvenient to our charts. He looked at me as if to say, "Look at the person who thinks all of this can be fixed with a stamp." We left a little of the ledger's memory in place. It saved the intern and a small, public performance, a puppet show of lost minutes that made a neighborhood kinder for a month. At that, Harmon gave a tight smile. "The bureaucracy is not only a machine for continuity," he said. "It is a machine for preserving the accidental kindnesses that institutional life produces." That sentence lodged in me like a paperclip in a sheath for forms small and sharp and entirely useful. The slip, I realized, might be a symptom of a deeper question: what do we keep and why? The Bureau's job is to make sure that when things happen, they are legible afterward. But legibility is not the same as goodness. A perfectly legible world can be an arid one. Harmon showed us maps, old redaction rotes, a ledger of machines with a column-marked temperament. The maps were beautiful and unnerving, lines that looked like the ears of someone eavesdropping on a conversation between a comma and a semicolon. And in the margin of a map there was a note written in a careful hand: "Unattended redaction machines breed opinions." We followed the ink crumbs. The slip, Whatever it was, had a style. Commas rearranged themselves into little constellations, salutations shifted tone. And one poor postscript moved from the end of a letter to the middle of a paragraph, and then back again depending on what day it felt like being. The small things were the most telling because they signaled intention. Accident begets accident, but habit begets personality. Owen produced a smudged index card. "I kept this," he said. "It will tell you what the slip likes." He dropped it in my hand. It smelled faintly of coffee and something sweet, like the memory of a pastry. On the card was a scribble, likes apostrophes, dislikes closing parentheses. Expensive in punctuation, how do we catch it? I asked, feeling suddenly younger than every ledger in the building. Like anything with preferences, me's. Ledger said, with something it wants and something we can afford to give. Bait, Harmon observed, and a ledger keyed to our intention. We must not be brusque. The slip resents being forced. I felt, in that moment, the full stretch of absurdity that our office contained. We were planning a confrontation with a creature born of mistakes by using the very protocols that had created those mistakes in the first place. It was like trying to cure a fever by counting how many beads are on the rosary that made it. But then, of course, it made sense. Bureaucracy is ritual. Ritual is the only language that some of these things will understand. Owen laughed, a small, rueful sound. "You sound like a therapy manual for paperwork," he said. "We are going to have to bait it with punctuation and then sign it in triplicate. And also name it," Ms. Ledger added. "Naming is the first stapling." We left Harmon with a list of forms he would initial and guidelines for what counts as bait. He gave me his humming key, wrapped in a silk scarf so it would not feel alone. I held it and felt the tremor of responsibility run through my fingers like a current. Harmon did not give keys lightly. "Keep your pens close," he said. "And remember that not all errors are vermin. Some are small friends." On the walk back to the office, the building seemed to sigh around us. People in the hallway moved, as if they had been given a script with a missing line. Their motions were polite and slightly offbeat. There was a retired version of Ms. Ledger in the stairwell who smiled at no one, and then shrugged back into the past, as if embarrassed by an anniversary. The slip had already been busy. "So what do we do with a creature that is a conscience and a nuisance?" I asked Owen. "We make a case," he said. "We do the work the way an honest clerk would when given a theft, inventory the losses, propose a remedy, and, if necessary, charm the witnesses." I thought of that ledger that ate an intern's day and of the kindness it had left behind. Everything in the bureau felt suddenly like a negotiation. We were not eradicators by nature, we were mediators. The slip had a position, and the bureau had to answer. By the time I returned to my desk, my head had folded itself into new shapes. I filed the humming key under urgent, Harmon, and wrote a 2-line memo to Registrar Amy asking for emergency stamps. I made coffee that tasted of metal and willpower and sat down with a stack of forms that suddenly looked like the battlements of a castle we had built to keep the world's stories inside orderly bricks. Even before lunch, I could tell the day had altered. There was a current in the air, something like a rumor starting to circle the headquarters. People walked with their hands full of memos and their faces open to the possibility of being asked to decide what to save. It is amazing the way a single named thing can rearrange an institution. We had in short order a plan. Not a perfect one. Bureaucracy does not allow perfection without enormous paperwork, and a hearing, but a plan that included bait, a alleged trap, and a request for a procedural exception that only Harmon could authorize. It included Ms. Ledger's patience, Owen's improvisation, and my newness, which made me both more willing to be brave and more likely to make a dangerous mistake. When I left the corridor and returned to the humming center of the office, the smear of ink in memes, Ledger's doorway gave me a look like a question mark. It seemed to have multiplied a comma to greet me. I stepped over it carefully and felt absurdly like a person walking into a family meeting where a relative has finally been named and must account for their behavior. If the slip was a criticism, it was one that had chosen punctuation as its weapon. If it was an artist, it had sloppy hands and a soft spot for unpunctuated lists. If it was an idea, it argued that life should keep its little surprises, and that a perfect calendar was a kind of tyranny. Whatever it was, by the time the clocks chimed twice and the office arranged itself into teams, the old redaction routes had a new urgency. We would trace, we would bait, we would negotiate. And I would, with whatever steadiness I could muster, try to do right by a world that had suddenly become both more fragile and more alive. We were, in the language of the Bureau, in an escalation. It is a quiet, paper-scented kind of escalation, more like a chorus that gains a new timbre than a cannonade. But escalation enough, the slip had been named, Harmon had been consulted, and a key hummed in my pocket. The basement of amendments, where the slip's origin had been rumored to lie, was now a place with a highlighted path on a map. We would go there. We would ask questions of machines and against machines. We would, in short, do our work. There was only one small caveat before we could begin. The slip did not like being forced. It liked being invited. The invitation, I would learn, requires paper, coffee, and the courage to let a few things remain wrong on purpose. We had time before lunch, and the building's soft thunder began to roll like an applause that might be for us or merely a weather event. Either way, the next step was clear and oddly intimate. We would go look into the margins and see what had become of our discarded edits. When I closed Mies' ledger's door behind us, the smear in the threshold shifted like a person who had only been pretending to sleep. It left a single apostrophe behind, as if to say, not finished. And we were not finished either. The file of our lives had a blank space now that smelled of toner and possibility. We should probably be careful what we wrote there. The slip had taste. The hook of the next step was a simple, bureaucratic necessity. To trace the slip, you must visit the basement of amendments. And to visit the basement, you must secure an exemption signed by Harmon and witnessed by Mies' ledger. That paperwork lives in the next chapter, waiting for a pen and a daring hand.